This video is based on the book Fairest Picture Mark Twain at Lake Tahoe by David C. Antonucci. The narration is performed by John Greenman. We invite you to join us as we travel back 150 years to a time when Lake Tahoe was still an untamed wilderness, and a young Samuel L. Clemens began his journey that would take him to his alternate persona as Mark Twain. We will relive some of Mark Twain's adventures and retrace his steps as he explored Lake Tahoe. We will name some of the places he visited and hear the words he wrote about Lake Tahoe. Mark Twain is one of the most revered and loved American authors. Some would say he was the father of the modern American novel. Mark Twain created an immense body of classics, short stories, articles, and letters. Throughout his life he traveled abroad and visited many lakes. He always compared these lakes to Lake Tahoe. Tahoe was his gold standard, and these other lakes never measured up to the exceptional beauty and Zen-like emotions that Tahoe provoked in his mind. There exists much misinformation and confusion over Mark Twain's activities and locations at Lake Tahoe, and in particular the place of his ill-fated timber claim and accidental wildfire. How did we go about figuring out the actual settings and experiences of Mark Twain at Lake Tahoe? Roughing It is the core source, but scholars consider it to be a work of creative nonfiction, as it has inaccuracies, omissions, misrepresented events, and exaggerations. To interpret his writing fully and accurately, we need to include letters written by him during the same period, articles he wrote for newspapers, lectures he gave, and historical accounts and old maps. To these sources we add the science of limnology, which is the study of freshwater lakes and streams, and includes geology, physics, and water quality. Knowledge of these subjects helps us better understand the natural conditions in the 1860s and reconstruct Lake Tahoe as Mark Twain knew it. Finally, we added critical thinking to analyze and interpret Twain's writings as he intended them. The result was the 2012 book, Fairest Picture Mark Twain at Lake Tahoe. The story begins in 1861, with brothers Sam Clemens on the left and Orion Clemens. The outbreak of Civil War shut down shipping on the Mississippi River and put Sam out of a job as a riverboat pilot. President Abraham Lincoln had appointed Orion to the position of Secretary of Nevada Territory, requiring he travel west from his home in Missouri. His brother Sam offered to go with him and pay Orion's stagecoach fare to Nevada in exchange for a job working for him as an assistant to the secretary. The two agree, and Sam Clemens, later to be known as Mark Twain, travels with his brother Orion from Missouri to Carson City, Nevada Territory. This map shows the route the two brothers took, after passage on a steamboat to St. Joseph, Missouri, and then by stagecoach to Carson City in the Nevada Territory. They traveled over 20 days between Missouri to the territorial capital. Clemens spent the next 5½ years in western Nevada, Mother Lode, and San Francisco. It is here Clemens began his literary career and assumed the pen name of Mark Twain. The account of the trip is in Twain's 1872 book, Roughing It, and was based on the diary Orion kept during the journey. This drawing depicts the scene that greeted Orion and Sam Clemens when they arrived in Carson City in mid-August 1861. Carson City began as Eagle Ranch and evolved into a small community because it was on the Central Wagon Road west. The site was laid out as a town in hopes of becoming the territorial capital. Most buildings were simple tents with a dirt floor or wood platform and canvas sidewalls. The community was hot, dry, and wild, and beyond its outskirts, desolate. Here we begin Mark Twain's story of his North Shore timber claim and wildfire adventure. The quote shown comes directly from Roughing It and expresses Twain's intent to stake a land claim and sell its timber for profit. In the mining region around the Comstock, there was tremendous demand for wood products for mine shoring, building material, and fuel. By late 1861, the forests between Virginia City and the Carson Range had either been cut or claimed by speculators. Big-time lumbering moved into the Tahoe Basin as the land became available for settlement as part of the creation of the Nevada Territory. The law allowed one to claim ownership of 320 acres of public land and sell the timber rights. As it turned out, the newly arrived Sam Clemens was not able to get work with his brother until October 1st, and he turned to land acquisition and mining speculation to support himself. Mark Twain's Lake Tahoe of 1861 to 65 was a very different place than today. It was still a wilderness. Only two rudimentary roads serviced by a string of roadhouses crossed the region. The roadhouses served miners, teamsters, and camp followers traveling east in droves to the Comstock lode in Virginia City. Native American campsites of the Washoe tribe situated themselves around the lake shore at significant stream outlets. Here tribal members fished, hunted, and gathered plants for food and worshiped the lake as the tribe's spiritual center. Large, well-spaced trees in a virgin old-growth forest blanketed the watershed. The still pristine forest did not see significant cutting until the 1860s, when large-scale commercial lumbering began on the east shore. In the latter half of the 19th century, loggers would eventually deplete 95% of the accessible timber stands around the lake. There was no outlet dam as there is now, and the lake drained unimpeded into its only outlet, the Truckee River. The shoreline was much more rugged, with fewer beaches compared to today. It was a colder climate, as the earth was coming out of the Little Ice Age, that was a period of global cooling in the middle of the second millennia. Unlike today, year-round snow-capped mountains encircled the lake. The water was much colder, perhaps 2 to 4 degrees colder. Water clarity was over 110 feet, which is about 50% more clarity than today. There was no green algae slime growing on the rocks from pollution, as we see today. The forests and meadows harbored diverse and abundant wildlife, including species we do not see today: mountain sheep, grizzlies, wolverines, and sage grouse. Mark Twain would be dismayed to see how his beloved Lake Tahoe has changed. This slide shows Sam Clemens' route from Carson City to Lake Tahoe. Shortly after reaching Carson City, Clemens befriended another new arrival, a young man named John Kinney from Ohio. The two hatched a plan to become partners on a timber claim. In mid-September, the two set off on foot from Carson City, carrying only blankets and axes. Twain said friends told him it was 11 miles. They entered what is now Ash Canyon, east of Carson City, and followed it up to the first summit. It probably was a rudimentary road transitioning to a trail. Mark Twain doesn't say what they walked on. We do know there were two functioning sawmills in Ash Canyon, built in 1859 and 1861, and therefore access roads had to exist to accommodate the logging and hauling of wood products. We also know that Washoe tribal members ascended Ash Canyon as they followed the deer herds and moved into the tribe's summering grounds at Lake Tahoe. From Ash Canyon Road, The two hikers connected to the Washoe Trail, an old 49er trail that linked the Washoe Valley in Nevada with the Mother Lode in California, and they followed it all the way to Lake Tahoe. This cross-section shows the topographical match to the Roughing It account. This account described walking a long time on the flat ground, ascending steep mountains, crossing a valley, ascending a second summit, and then descending toward Lake Tahoe. The two men probably left well before sunrise and walked under a full moon. The September 1861 astronomical calendar shows a full moon around the 18th of the month, which is the same time Clemens began his journey. As he stumbled out of the forest and rounded a bend in the trail, this is the view that surprised Mark Twain. He recalled nearly 10 years later in Roughing It, "We plodded on 2 or 3 hours longer, and at last the lake burst upon us, a noble sheet of blue water lifted 6,300 feet above the level of the sea, and walled in by a rim of snow-clad mountain peaks that towered aloft full 3,000 feet higher still. It was a vast oval, and one would have to use up 80 or 100 good miles in traveling around it. As it lay there, with the shadows of the mountains brilliantly photographed upon its still surface, I thought it must surely be the fairest picture the whole earth affords." This interpretive panel was placed in 2015 to commemorate Mark Twain's sighting of Lake Tahoe. The site marks the approximate location where Twain recalls seeing Lake Tahoe for the first time. It was this memory that inspired him to write, in 1872, that Lake Tahoe was the fairest picture the whole earth affords. Nevada State Parks installed the panel and bench seating with funding from Tunnel Creek Lodge. The inscription on the bench recognizes the Incline Village, Crystal Bay Historical Society. You can hike or mountain bike on the Tunnel Creek Road to this location, as it is only 1.4 miles from the Tunnel Creek Cafe in Incline Village, Nevada. As we continue with day one of the adventure, they arrive at the only sandy beach along a rocky shoreline. Here they find a small skiff left there by the Irish Brigade, a group of friends Clemens met in Carson City. Clemens and Kinney row across Crystal Bay. Twain describes it as a deep bend of the lake. The Roughing It text says it was 3 miles, but actually it was 3.4 miles. This sepia illustration is from Roughing It, and portrays the two men crossing Crystal Bay in a rowboat. They land on State Line Point and camp there the first night. They find a cache of food, cooking utensils, and fishing gear hidden for them in the rocks. Twain wrote they slept in the warm sand among protecting granite boulders as ants crawled over them throughout the evening. This slide more precisely shows the State Line Point campsite location on a modern-day aerial photo. This site is a public beach owned by California County of Placer and is known as Speedboat Beach. The beach is at the foot of Harbor Avenue, and parking is limited if you plan to go there. This picture shows a ground-level photograph of the beach campsite as it looks today. Note the large boulders that Twain mentioned in Roughing It. On day 2, Clemens and Kinney travel 3 miles on foot along the shoreline to a place where they decide to make their timber claim. Kinney says the terrain on State Line Point is too steep to go back the way they came. First they try to paddle back on logs, but find the lake roiled with wind and waves. They decide to continue another 3 miles to an unoccupied squatter's cabin that they saw as they were hiking, and arrived there at dusk. They find no food, and end up playing cribbage at the cottage, waiting for the moon to rise to give light for their return. They discover the owner's dugout canoe. This image is a picture of how the dugout canoe might have looked. They then paddle back 6 miles to their State Line Point campsite. In a letter to his mother and sister, Clemens tells of eating dinner and playing the card game faro on a flat granite rock. This image is a photo of the flat granite rock that Twain and Kinney used as a dining and card table. On day 3 they catch a Lahontan cutthroat trout and eat it for breakfast. They board the rowboat and travel 3 miles from the State Line Point campsite to the new timber claim and post notices on a tree. The two begin work on building a log house, but give it up as the work is too tiring. They decide to construct a lean-to of brush and saplings instead. They go back by boat to the State Line Point campsite and camp overnight in that location. On day 4 the pair again go 3 miles by boat to the timber claim to continue working and return by nightfall. They could have camped anywhere along the strip of beach in the western extent of what is modern-day Tahoe Vista. Using the mileage quoted by Clemens and judging from old photos, historical maps, and scientific studies, this is the most likely location. There was a beach here in 1861, but only on the west end of Tahoe Vista. Between Tahoe Vista and Kings Beach it was a boulder shoreline, so it further helps to locate the timber claim site. Of course it is entirely different now, with endless beach between the two towns because of erosion of the shoreline caused by the Tahoe Dam built in 1913. Mark Twain made an interesting observation that it was 1 to 2 miles to the blue water line from this site when they rowed out onto the lake. The blue water line is the boundary where the visible bottom drops out of sight, and one only sees the cobalt blue water of Lake Tahoe. This spectacular phenomenon is still the case today. This illustration comes from Roughing It, and shows how the lean-to house described by Twain might have looked. The laws governing the claiming of public land for private ownership required the construction of a dwelling and fencing of the property. Twain said that the brush house was too fragile to sleep in, and instead the two continued to sleep in the sand on the beach. On day 5 Clemens and Kinney spent the morning drifting in the rowboat off State Line Point, looking at giant boulders submerged in the water. This illustration, taken from Roughing It, depicts the two men straining over the gunwales of the rowboat to peer down into the sparkling clear water. Mark Twain said he saw gray boulders and white boulders, and the rocks were of a massive size, as large as a village church, as we see here in this photo of the rocks that rise above the water surface. Later in the day, with supplies on board, they traveled by boat from the State Line Point campsite to the timber claim. Clemens let his unattended campfire get out of control, igniting the forest in a spectacular and mesmerizing display of flame and firebrands. This image shows John Kinney sprinting through the wall of fire as Clemens stands in disbelief near the rowboat. Standing from their vantage point on the beach, they watched the wildfire burning through the night, scarring the forest and igniting standing dead trees in an intense blaze. While Twain's description in Roughing It paints the picture of a highly destructive conflagration, the truth is that the forest of live trees was only scorched, and not severely damaged, as he would have us believe. Twain's timber claim was in a mature forest, well adapted to periodic wildfire. After watching the blaze reach beyond their view, the two retired to the warm sand, only to discover in the morning that the fire reversed direction overnight and burned to within a few feet of their beds, covering them in ash and soot. They jumped into the cold lake to wash. On day 6, the two frustrated would-be timber barons packed up what belongings survived the fire and traveled 6 miles by boat back to the east shore. From there they hiked back to Carson City and paid their friends for the lost and burned equipment. There is some evidence that Clemens returned a brief time later with other companions to finish the timber claim work. However, despite promising his sister in a letter to do so, he never completed the steps necessary to lay an ownership claim to his timber ranch. Researchers believe that Clemens could not perfect his rights because he had wandered too far west into California. At that time, the only land within the Tahoe Basin available to homestead was within the Nevada Territory portion, and did not include the ground on the California side. This map shows the locations of the main points of interest relevant to the timber claim and wildfire adventure. All of these places are on public land and easily accessible by visitors. On this map there are more than 20 points of interest shown here and field verified to correspond to location descriptions in Roughing It and Sam Clemens' letters home. Most of these are unique to this area and do not occur elsewhere at Lake Tahoe. The 2 points colored in yellow have yet to be entirely confirmed, but are nonetheless consistent with the other proven points of interest. After the failed timber claim venture, Clemens turned his attention to other endeavors. He bought a horse at an auction, what he called a genuine Mexican plug that turned out to be unrideable. He tried staking a mining claim in central Nevada, but ended up getting trapped for days on high ground during the Great Flood of 1862. Still interested in striking a fortune in mining, Clemens traveled south to the boomtown of Aurora in the Nevada Territory, near Mono Lake, and close to the California border. He discovered a valuable mineral lode there, as depicted in these drawings from Roughing It, and dreamed of a life of wealth and luxury. However, he and his partner, Calvin Higbee, miscommunicated on filing the legal papers, and neither did the necessary steps. So, sadly, their fortune was lost to claim jumpers. To support himself, Clemens resorted to manual labor at a quartz mill, as this image from Roughing It shows. However, his life was about to take a new direction that would carry him throughout his career. Starting with his arrival in the Nevada Territory, he occasionally wrote letters to the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise. Today we would call these letters columns. He signed them with the pen name of Josh during this period, and caught the attention of Joe Goodman, the editor. Goodman offered him a temporary job for $25 per week as a reporter to fill in during the absence of his regular writer, Dan DeQuille. In September of 1862, Twain walked about 150 miles from Aurora to Virginia City to report for work. It was here he first used the pen name Mark Twain, and assumed that public persona in February 1863. Mark Twain worked as a favorite reporter and humorist until forced to leave the Nevada Territory abruptly in May 1864. His need to elude arrest for threatening a duel with the editor of a rival newspaper triggered this sudden departure, and he landed in San Francisco, where he began to work as a correspondent for various publications. During his time as a journalist in Virginia City, he came down with a respiratory illness in August 1863 and traveled by stagecoach to Lake Tahoe in search of a cure. A congested and coughing Mark Twain traveled to Lake House on the south shore of Lake Tahoe to cure his illness. The red arrow on this map shows the location of Lake House. Lake House was a well-known Tahoe establishment serving travelers and visitors in a hotel-like atmosphere. In this era, popular thought was that engaging nature could treat illness and infirmity with clean air and water free of the pollution in cities. This is a photo of Lake House taken in 1865, where Twain sought treatment for his cold. While there, he fell in with a crowd of wealthy people from San Francisco and Virginia City who liked to party. He danced, rode horses, and sailed on the lake, and complained in a letter to his mother that he got no rest. After partying all day, at night he tried various cures. One cure was to cover him with cold, wet sheets. Another was to mix a concoction of onion juice and gin and drink it. He stayed several days at Lake House, then returned to Steamboat Springs, south of present-day Reno. There he inhaled vapors emanating from fissures. That did not work either. So he traveled back through Tahoe to San Francisco, where time and the humid air seemed to alleviate his symptoms. Mark Twain wrote about sailing on the lake while staying at Lake House. This photo shows the Lake House excursion sailboat at the dock near the hotel, and is very likely the boat that he sailed on. This map shows what we believe is the location of Lake House, at the end of a public street in the Al Tahoe residential area of South Lake Tahoe, California. Like many of the sites mentioned in this video, one can visit this place and stand where he stood, see what Twain saw, and feel what Twain felt among the astounding beauty of Lake Tahoe. Much of what has been written about Mark Twain's time at Lake Tahoe is inaccurate. We take a closer look at some of these myths and legends. Before we conclude, we would like to debunk some of the more popular myths that link Mark Twain to Lake Tahoe. The first fable was that he stayed at the Lake Shore House Hotel in Glenbrook, Nevada, on the east shore of Lake Tahoe. This tale appears in a footnote to a compendium of letters written by Sam Clemens and Mark Twain, but relies on faulty research, since Lake Shore House was not constructed until 1876, long after Mark Twain had left the area for good. One particularly significant error is an East Shore timber claim myth that relies on irrational reasoning, rejection of substantial evidence, and magical thinking. Another legend that appeared in a Mark Twain biography of his bachelor years has him staying at the Hobart lumber camp. Hobart did not exist until the 1880s, when loggers from the Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company moved in to cut down the forest well after Twain's 1866 departure. Another myth is that Mark Twain visited Cascade Lake in the 1870s or 1880s. Mark Twain was never in the West during this period and could not have been there. It is either a case of mistaken identity with John Muir or the appearance of a Mark Twain impostor. Another myth is that the timber claim and Wildfire were in Zephyr Cove, based solely on Clemens' letter that talks about a place, eventually called Sam Clemens Bay, that many think refers to Zephyr Cove. Where exactly, then, are the verified, documented places in the Lake Tahoe region that Mark Twain visited during his time in the West? These are the 5 documented locations in the region visited by Twain during his years in the West. They cover campsites, roadhouses, and towns he visited or passed through and later mentioned. The North Shore is the actual site of his timber claim and accidental wildfire. Present day South Lake Tahoe is where he stayed at Lake House to cure his cold. Logan Shoals is where he visited briefly at a roadhouse and wrote a laudatory article about his stay. Silver Mountain City in Alpine County, California, is a now defunct mining boomtown visited by Twain for a story on the mining excitement. Present-day Truckee is the town where Twain had a short stopover on a trip by railway, sleigh over snow, and stagecoach on his way to an 1868 lecture in Virginia City. As we conclude, we leave you with the vivid words of Mark Twain that so aptly capture the beauty, serenity, and uniqueness of Lake Tahoe. We plodded on, and at last the lake burst upon us, a noble sheet of blue water lifted 6,300 feet above the level of the sea, and walled in by a rim of snow-clad mountain peaks that towered aloft full 3,000 feet higher still. As it lay there with the shadows of the mountains brilliantly photographed upon its still surface, I thought it must surely be the fairest picture the whole earth affords. The book, Fairest Picture Mark Twain at Lake Tahoe, on which this video is based, is available on Amazon.com and your local bookstore by special order.